they actually create documents or create content, and they actually consume that. These are people that would get a phone call asking where something is or asking for an answer to a question. So they're the real purveyors of the information. We want to get them into a room and facilitate them to identify top-down taxonomy design, to come up with the top level of a potential structure for our systems. And the idea here is that through this concept, we're not just going to define that primary taxonomy that might be used for storage, that topical listing, that topical hierarchy. We'll also have additional metadata fields, additional ways of categorizing content fall out of the back end as a beautiful side effect of this. And I'll give you more on that in a second. But the short of it is that we're looking at a starter taxonomy here, a jumping off point to go further into the process with, and to do it as a quick start. So the first exercise that we want to do when we get everybody in the room, again, you've got 12 to 18 folks in the room sitting around a round table at this point, is identify the audience, identify the end users. And we want to whiteboard all of this because we know people learn by seeing and learn by experiencing and learn by doing. This is one way that we want them to help connect the dots. So we write everything up on the board, and what you'll typically see at this stage is that you get a mix of different things. When we talk about audience, some people will think organizationally and start naming different departments. Some people will think geographically. They'll say, well, we've got audience in New York, we've got audience in London, we've got audience wherever else. Some people think functionally. It doesn't really matter. We just want to get the spectrum of users up on the board. And the other thing we want to do at this point is start identifying our lowest common denominator. So we know that there's a range of users, some of whom were born with a mouse in their hand, are incredibly technologically savvy, and others are scared of the computer. And so we want to keep that in mind. We know that some people have English as their first language and others don't. We want to keep that in mind. There is pretty much an infinite number of ways that we can describe how people are different. And so we want to get that up on the board and understand those differences. The reason largely here is to understand the challenge, to set the expectation for this group that there are a lot of different people for whom we need to design. And coming up with a single vocabulary for them is a challenge, but it is one that can be accomplished. So we start with this, and in fact what we might come out with is a mini taxonomy of different audience types. For an external portal, it might be employees and partners and customers and business partners in the public. For a website, it might be a little broader. You see this a lot on the federal side, educator, student, business, so on and so forth. The short of it, though, is that we want to understand for whom we're building. And once we get to that point, we can move on to our next exercise, which is to identify the verbs. Now, this is done to get us to the next step. And it's always an interesting thing to see what exactly the outcome is, what the words people identify are. But the recommended configuration here is that everybody that you've got in your room, your 12 to 18 people, you say, all right, on a piece of paper now, write down for me 7 verbs, seven things that our organization does, or 7 things that you would expect somebody to want to be able to do in this content management system or in this portal or in this website. And what you'll see is that they come up with any number of words. Research, search, design, configure, build, deliver. It doesn't really matter. The idea simply is that we get all of these up here, we get the verbs down. And once we do this, we now have a pathway to take us into what we really care about, which are the nouns, or the topics. Now, the reason we do verbs first is simple. If I were to, right from the start, ask people to start identifying topics, they would cheat. They would come up with a number of organizational entities. They would come up with a bunch of document types. They would come up with a number of things that just kind of flow out of the way that you typically think. But it's oddly difficult for people to come up with just clean topics or clean nouns right from the start. So instead, we ask them for these verbs, and then we can draw a blank right after them. Buy what? Guarantee what? Ship what? Build what? And by asking that what, it makes it much easier for them to fill in the blanks and to give us pure topics, which is what we want for our core taxonomy. So we write them all up on the board, and as an aside, even if there are duplicates, we want to write those up. In fact, that's a critical piece of this, and you'll see why in a minute. The first thing we do once we fill up our board with all of these different nouns or topics is eliminate the non-starters. And in fact, you'll have a lot more non-starters than I've just crossed off. People will always try and slip document types in. They'll always try and slip organizational names in. And they'll always try and put some locations in as well. And none of those, as we know, are pure topics.